Hi, my name is Stacy Beecham. As you know, there are many aspects to consider along the pathway of medical device development. Today, we will visit four key points of interest related to medical device software that works together with medical devices or in vitro diagnostic devices. Let's take a little trip and explore.
A little trip, take a little trip, take a little trip to see. Take a little trip, take a little trip, take a little trip with me.
The 4 points of interest we will cover today are define, classify, qualify, and test. We start by defining the intended use, followed by indications for use, and finally, we define the software functionality, including the algorithms that are used to treat or diagnose the clinical condition. Next, you will classify your software. Is it considered software as a medical device that can operate on its own accord, or is the software a component or integral part of another medical device or system? Qualifying your software involves determining the standards, regulations, and guidance that apply, qualifying the classification of the software as a medical device, and qualifying the safety and performance measures that you will use to gather evidence that the software accuracy, specificity, and algorithm function are effective in treating or diagnosing the clinical condition. Finally, we will use the safety and performance objectives that you defined in the qualification stage to test the device software with the device or as a separate testing measure, apart from the device if it's a standalone software, to prove that it is at least as safe and effective as other softwares that are aiming to treat or diagnose the same medical condition, or in other words, have the same intended medical purpose. Our first point of interest is defining your software. You will start by defining the intended use or intended medical purpose of your software. The key factor to consider here is the disease state or clinical condition that the software aims to help treat or diagnose. Secondly, you will need to define your indications for use, including the intended patient population and the setting for use of the device that utilizes your software. For example, is it used in the hospital, long-term care facility, in emergency or ambulatory care situations, or in a home setting? And finally, you will need to define your safety and performance parameters. Our second point of interest is classifying your software. In the US, medical device software follows the same classification as medical devices and in vitro devices. So it's either class 1, class 2, or class 3, with class 1 being the lowest risk. In addition, the FDA requires that you assign a level of concern to your software, either minor, class A, moderate, class B, or major, class C. In Europe, classification is in two buckets: software as medical device or software that operates within a medical device. If you do decide that your software is software as a medical device or operates as a medical device in its own right, then you will assign a risk classification to it, and then you will also choose the classification rule that best applies. In the US, medical device software follows the same classification that is used for all medical devices. Software is regulated by the FD&C Act, which defines a medical device as an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related article, including any component, part, or accessory, which is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man, or is intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man, and is not excluded pursuant to Section 520 of the FD&C Act. Now, the first stop on the US regulatory roadmap is the same as in the EU. Define the intended use of the software. Next, you'll want to figure out which regulations and standards apply Then you will determine the device risk class, so class 1, 2, or 3. In addition, the FDA does require that you assign a level of concern based on the guidance. These levels are minor, moderate, and major, or class A, B, or C. Now, C is the default for all software. You can think of it as guilty until proven innocent. Until you can prove that your software should be at a lower level of concern, it is by default assigned class C, major level of concern. Finally, determine the appropriate FDA product code. For example, DXN is the product code for cardiac electrophysiology diagnostics and monitoring devices. Now let's look at the software pathway to market and classification in Europe. There are two market pathways for software that relates to medical devices in Europe. One, software that is regulated as a medical device in its own right, and two, software that is an integral part or component of the device, but does not act on its own accord. The first step you will take with your software is to identify the risk class. You can see here that there's a structure and some situational guidance in this table that puts the software in a high, medium, or low risk class. The next thing you would like to do is to consult the classification rules. You need to figure out which rules apply to your software, not to the device that the software is part of or acts on, but to the software itself. Since the US and Europe group software into different categories based on the appropriate regulations, it's important to look at how software is regulated in the various jurisdictions in which you plan to market your device software. Now, I will say that the US and Europe are pretty closely aligned, but they do follow different processes when it comes to regulating software. For example, the US software for medical devices is regulated under the FD&C Act, whether it's for medical devices, in vitro devices, mobile apps, AI-enabled devices, so on and so forth. Whereas Europe divides the software into medical devices and in vitro devices and regulates them under each separate regulation. And I would say the MDCG 2019-11 guidance is very helpful in deciphering what the expectations are around software for IVDs and for MDs and for mobile applications and so on and so forth. One nice thing is that the IMDRF is a global organization, and they have put together a software as a medical device working group that has issued guidance over the last several years and is trying to keep up with the ever evolving and changing landscape of medical device software and mobile applications and wearable and AI enabled device software. And there is also a consensus standard, the IEC 62304, that is harmonized globally and is applicable in all jurisdictions. And finally, we find ourselves at the fourth point of interest, testing your software. Making sure you have measurable safety and performance objectives is key to product approval, clinical evaluation, and everything you're going to do with that device software in the future and post-market activities. To ensure your software is measuring up, be sure to follow the IEC 62304 standard, which outlines the global state-of-the-art software development process followed for both medical devices and in vitro diagnostic medical devices. One of our webinar friends sent in a great related question. Are there any special considerations for medical device software using MDCG 2020-1? That's the clinical evaluation guidance under the MDR and IVDR regulations when developing safety and performance parameters. I would say the main goals to keep in mind with respect to safety outcomes are cybersecurity and any direct or indirect impact that the software or connectivity issues could potentially have on the patient or the ability of the healthcare practitioner to treat the patient. So keep in mind that includes any impact to the information collected, patient records, data, anything that has been collected that could affect treatment or diagnosis decisions as well. And as far as performance objectives are concerned, it is best to isolate measurable performance outcomes as they relate to the software functions themselves, not to the whole device or to the device systems, but to the functions that the actual software performs. Now I'd like to take some time and answer some of the additional questions that have been submitted by folks who have registered for our webinar today. Does a Class 2B standalone software without direct safety concern to the patient require clinical data? Good question. First, let's consult the MDCG 2019-11 guidance, which explains the classification outlined in the MDR Annex 8 Rule 11 to see why the software might be classified as 2B. I'm not sure if that's a classification that you arrived at on your own or if it was a recommendation from a notified body or regulatory body. But either way, if you believe that the risk class is class 2B, then according to the guidance and according to the MDR Rule 11, it would be considered to cause serious risk to the patient, as you can see here in the second row down in the first column, treat or diagnose, based on the fact that it may cause serious deterioration of a person's state of health or surgical intervention, using that because that diagnostic information informs the treatment regimen, treatment plan. So if you do believe that your classification is correct at 2B, then yes, you'll need to collect clinical data from either existing public published literature, existing data for your device would be ideal, of course. And then you'll want to also consider the state of the art other therapies, other software related to therapies that are meant to diagnose the same conditions that are prescribed in your intended use. Our product is a software medical component of our customer's end product, which is an X-ray system. How much clinical data do we need? This is a great question. I don't know the algorithms and exact functionality of your X-ray software, but it could be a standalone software that could operate with other types of devices or other types of X-ray devices even. It could be a component and it could be an accessory, just depending on the functionality and how it interfaces with the device, how specific it is to that device and the functionality and how generic or specific or custom that is. But what I will tell you is there has been reclassification for medical image analyzers in recent years. You can see here in January of 2020, an article was published. I put an excerpt in here about how the FDA reclassified these medical image analyzers and some of the other radiology devices from class 3 to class 2. Some of them were able to achieve the de novo classification, some weren't. And they were assigned a new product code, that category of devices, MYN. So if you go into the FDA 510K database and look up MYN, of course they're in the 510K database because it's considered now a class 2. The MYN medical image analyzer category will bring up devices such as this chest CAD device. There's a whole list of them. It's all public information, of course. And you can see here that this chest CAD device is computer-assisted detection software device that analyzes chest radiograph studies using machine learning techniques. Now, whether your device has an AI or machine learning component or not is really not the basis of the classification. It's how it interfaces with the clinical condition and what the software functionality and algorithms look like in order to treat or diagnose that clinical condition. So some food for thought here, but the clinical data that you would collect would be similar to any class 2 device. And for Europe, similar again. The clinical evaluation is not too entirely different between the US and Europe. Safety and performance outcomes, I would look at the FDA database and look at the summaries of the 510Ks, kind of see what they did to justify the safety and effectiveness of their software for these different medical image analyzers. Of course, some of them might have gone the extra mile since they were writing a PMA for a class 3 device if it was prior to 2020. So you might want to consider the devices that have been approved since 2020 as they submitted a 510K because they knew they would be class 2. Can a previous version of the same software serve as an equivalent device? Claiming equivalency is getting trickier and trickier. MedDev 2.7-1 Rev 4 was the first real outline of the requirements for claiming equivalency. The basis in that document was equivalence can only be demonstrated on the basis of one single medical device. The manufacturer also has to disclose the differences between their device and the comparator device, and the equivalent device must be CE marked. That was feasible at the time, but since that time, the MDR now requires that device to be equivalent to your device in 3 different areas: technical, biological, and clinical characteristics, all 3. So that makes it a little more difficult. MDCG 2020-5 does a great job of explaining the regulations and directives and how they refer to equivalence and how the equivalence requirements have changed and have really ramped up in recent years. What I have been hearing from notified bodies is that similar devices are the way to go. If you have any clinical data for your device, for your software, use that in conjunction with clinical data from similar devices. But the only downfall there is you cannot use the clinical data of the similar devices alone. That's not considered sufficient clinical evidence. You do have to have your own device or software specific clinical data to use in conjunction, and then you can show that your software or your device is at least as safe and effective as the similar devices on the market. How can we demonstrate state of the art for software as a medical device software? So let's keep in mind that there's a difference between SAMD and SIMD. I'm sure you know which your software is, but just as a refresher for the rest of us, software as a medical device is software that is a medical device and can perform those functions on its own. Software in a medical device is software that functions interactively with the medical device and probably can't stand alone and probably can't perform these functions in conjunction with another device. It's possible that an SIMD could be used for more than one device, but it wouldn't be like an off-the-shelf software that can be used for multiple purposes. So if we're considering this an SAMD, software that is regulated as a medical device in its own right, then we can demonstrate state of the art by looking at comparator softwares that are trying to achieve the same intended medical purpose. That's the key there, same intended medical purpose. So even if you feel like it's configured differently, a totally different type of approach to the software, totally different mode of action, if it's trying to treat the same clinical condition or diagnose the same clinical condition, then it would be considered a comparator software because of the functionality. You also want to look at alternatives. If you weren't using this software, what would you be using? What are the choices? What are your choices? What are the treatment options that people have to choose from? Your software or what? What is the alternative? You want to compare it to that as well. State of the art is meant to establish the therapeutic landscape and to bring the big picture to light of what the therapeutic options are to treat the disease state or diagnose the clinical condition that you are trying to treat or diagnose. How do we gather clinical data for an IVD software if no similar software exists? At the moment, we have limited knowledge on how IVD medical device software is going to be regulated. However, the tools we have right now are to follow what has been prescribed for the processes around evaluating software for medical devices in general. I would take that approach for the moment until we have more information. And don't be afraid to look for medical device software, not IVD software, but medical device software that has a similar functionality, similar algorithms, and is trying to treat or diagnose the same clinical condition, same intended purpose, similar functionality, similar algorithms. You might use a combination of devices. Maybe there is an IVD software that has some of the functionality that your software has. You can use that as a comparator. And then maybe there's medical device software that has the other functions that your device software has. Don't be afraid to mix and match at this point because we have limited information for IVDs, limited data. So during this transition time before the regulations really take effect and people really understand them and are applying them and putting that data into databases and publishing literature with that sort of data, we just have to do what we can with the information and tools that we have. What is the best way to analyze data for medical device software according to MDCG 2020-1? Including scientific validity and technical and clinical performance. I don't think there's just one answer for how to analyze your data, but SPS tools are handy, and of course there are other in-house tools. Even Excel has tools to analyze and synthesize data, put it in a cohesive format for submission purposes, for CERs and other reporting. But I think you're also asking how to collect that data and decipher which data would be most appropriate to use for maybe approval or post-market activities or various things. So in that case, we want to examine what it is that we're after. What are we after? How do we decipher what data is most appropriate and get right down to the data that proves the safety and effectiveness of the software? First, you want to examine the clinical association. How do the outputs from your performance of your software diagnose or treat the disease or clinical condition? You want to compare your outputs from your software to existing published literature outputs and also to the state of the art, which is comparator software or alternatives to the software. For analytical and technical performance, the goal is to try to assess how accurate and reliable is the performance of your software. And then, of course, the clinical performance deals with the specificity and sensitivity of the performance outputs. So that's where the statistical analysis is really important. Just got this new blood pressure monitor from my corporate wellness initiative. Let's see how it works. Let's see. Okay. So it says open app on phone. Okay. Press start. Okay. Read results on your phone. Cool. That's pretty slick. This is also a medical device. I hope that helps. After today's webinar, you will be receiving some reference material and source information related to the information that was presented today, and also related to the guidance documents, regulations, and standards that were referenced here and that apply to medical device software in both the European and US jurisdictions.
Right. Thanks so much, Stacy, for a wonderful presentation. That concludes our time here today. We have a couple announcements today. First, Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year for top regulatory services companies. If you have any upcoming medical, scientific, or writing projects that you would like to meet with us about, we have time set aside with our specialists. You can book a free consultation at consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you again so much, Stacy, and everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you next time. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.